In the previous video, we designed a slide-in component, a component that lets you slide content in to a page. It looks something like this. And we used the CSS transition property to animate the transition. And it looks pretty good, but can we do better? So in this video, we're going to use something called ReactSpring. So what is ReactSpring? ReactSpring is a JavaScript library that a lot of people use in React for animations. As you could see here on the website, which is actually very good, it says ReactSpring is a Spring physics-based animation library that should cover most of your UI-related animation needs. And the difference of approach with ReactSpring over your typical CSS transition is that usually CSS transition is just a question of duration, right? You go from point A to point B and you specify how long that's going to take you, right? This is a little bit different. This is based on how springs work. And you could see here certain properties that they use. So the spring mass, the tension, friction, and certain other properties. Now, if you want to go to your good old duration animation, you could do that. There's a property for that as well. But they really suggest doing this spring physics-based animation. So it's kind of hard to visualize it. So let's jump in and actually do an example. And then it should become easier to understand. So I'm switching to the app in which we created the slide-in component to the code. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually install the ReactSpring library. So we're going to do npm install ReactSpring. And because I'm using React 18, they have a beta version that works with React 18. It could very well be that by the time you watch this video, the regular version is going to, the latest ReactSpring version is going to support React 18 out of the box. But for now, we're going to go ahead and install this beta version. Okay, so it installed it. Let's go ahead and start the server again. And we're going to go in and create a spring-in component, similar to a slide-in component that we already have. So I'll create a folder called spring-in. And then we'll have a spring-in JS as well as spring-in.css. So just to compare to the slide-in version, let's just copy in the slide-in CSS properties into our spring-in CSS. We're going to change this to spring-in because that's the class that we're going to have in our component. And if you remember from last time, we had all these properties. So we started off in the negative all the way up. And then in the component itself, we transitioned using the transition properties specified in CSS to the new properties. So let's actually get rid of all that because all of this will be done in the component itself. And let's just leave a background color of green and the color. And now let's go into the component itself, and that you guys shouldn't be watching how I type all this code up. Let me go ahead and just paste it in. And basically there are three steps, I guess, a few steps over here we need to do. Number one, we need to import use Spring and animate it. And I'll get to what those things do in a minute. And then, so I guess that's kind of like step 0. Step 1 is to create these animated properties, I guess specify animated properties, and you do that with a use spring hook. Let me just make this a little more clear. So what we're doing is we're saying start from margin top of -200 and opacity 0. This is very similar to what I was doing in the slide-in component. So you start on top, all the way on top, but you can't even see the box. And then since there's nothing in front of these properties, these are going to be my final properties. So my opacity is going to start with 0 and go to 1. And my margin top is going to go from -200 to +5 pixels. And these are interesting properties here. I'm specifying the mass, the tension, and the friction. And again, I did show these properties on the ReactSpring website. They kind of specified what their default is and what you could specify what they do. And then once I specify those properties, the third step, I guess the second step, is use the properties created with ReactSpring. And you do that in the style tag by copying all these properties that you created here into the div. Now, notice the interesting thing here, this is not just a regular div, this is an A div. Now, what is an A div? A div is an animated div, which we imported. We imported animated as A because it's just simpler to type A than to type animated. So I could have just done this, animated, and then said animated div like so. And that would do the same thing, but it's too long to type. And instead, you just do animated as A, and then you specify a div like that, with an A div. Now, this is not just a div thing. You could specify it for any HTML element. So I could have, if this would have been a span, I could have done a span and so on. So now we go back to our app and we're going to specify this spring in component. But we're only going to do it when the start animation flag is true. So start animation, and then we're going to do this spring in component. Oops. Spring in. It automatically imports it. Thank you, VS Code. And we're gonna have a box with a text that says hello ReactSpring. All right, so let's see if this works. So you could see how the ReactSpring version is much more jumpy, right? It flies in and it like bounces in. Let's actually maybe remove the slide in for now just to see the difference. It comes in and it bounces in. And depending on how you adjust these properties here, config mass, so the mass, tension, and friction, for example, if you want to have increased the tension. So then let's see what happens. Boom, it's very tense. The spring is very tense, so when it comes in, it ends up bouncing up and down many times. Or let's say you increase the friction. Okay, because the friction is so big, it's larger. Let's try to increase the mass. Let's say up to 100. So if you imagine like a heavy object that ends up coming into the screen and bouncing around before it settles down in a restful position. Now, of course, if you just want to go back to your good old duration animation, you could do that, specify the value in milliseconds. So let's say 2000 milliseconds, which is 2 seconds. And then it's going to ditch all these other values and just use your good old boring duration animation. But otherwise, it actually uses the values that you specify for mass, tension, friction, and there are some other ones like clamp and velocity that you could specify, and you could play around with these and see how they work. All right, thank you for watching the video, and feel free to subscribe if you want to see more content like this.